Hi, this is Dan Thomas from Dagger.com. This tutorial will delve into the secrets behind the magic of creating great 2.5D image animations. During this tutorial, we will be animating a 3-layer image, and I'll show you the 3 secrets behind the magic, ooh, and much more. This tutorial is toolset agnostic, which means the lessons presented here are not specific to any particular software application. Just a quick note about available resources, then we'll get to it. On my YouTube channel and website, I have a tutorial on the basics of doing 2.5D animation. If you're new to this topic, you might want to view that tutorial first. I have a tutorial on using Apple Motion 5 to create the animation we use in this tutorial. I also have a music video with 33 examples of 2.5D images, including the examples shown in this tutorial. Lastly, be sure to check my YouTube channel or website for new tutorials or other videos as they become available. Whew. Glad that's over with. I'll bet you are too. Let's get on with the show. Here's the original image we're starting with. One of the first things you should do with an image is figure out what type of animation the image will support. Images with distinctly separate foreground and background layers are good for side-to-side movement, like this one. They're not limited to just side-to-side, of course. I'll go into more detail on the subject of choosing layers a little later in this tutorial. Images like ours, however, with no distinctly separate layers, really only work well with a zoom in or zoom out type of animation. Knowing that, let's take a closer look at this image. Notice how close the horse is in this picture. There's too much foreground and not enough background for a good zoom in type of animation, so let's expand the image. Here's the expanded image. I added another row of waves at the top by cloning portions of the second wave. I expanded the image horizontally and filled in the space with some more cloning. I also cut off some of the bottom because it isn't really needed. This gives us more room at the top of the image, which allows us to do a longer zoom in. Now that we have our starting image, let's design our animation. This is Apple Motion 5 with some of the panels hidden. It doesn't matter whether or not you use Motion, the point is to illustrate the techniques, not the software. But if you're interested, I have another tutorial that shows how I created this animation in Motion, so be sure to check it out. We're currently viewing this image from the camera's perspective. Let's change to viewing it from the side so we can see how the camera moves. I won't go into much detail here, I just want to show the camera move. You can see that the camera moves closer to the image, and it moves down while staying pointed at the center of the image. One more time. Here's what this looks like with our 1-layer image. Not very impressive, is it? It looks like a simple zoom in. So let's add some layers. First, we need to decide how many layers we need, or at least how many we think the image can provide. I think the best way to explain this is with examples. I have 3 examples. Each of them teaches us something different about layers. This is not one of my favorite animations, but it's good for this example. It has 2 very obvious layers, a foreground and a background. They're completely separate and don't touch each other at all. A no-brainer. Just cut out the frog and fill in the background. This one is a little less obvious. The hummingbird and the plants in focus could be 1 layer, and the out-of-focus stuff could be another layer. However, I separated the hummingbird into its own layer, so I could move it differently than the in-focus plants, and it worked quite well. This one has 3 fairly distinct layers, except for one very important issue. The obvious layers are the buildings in front, the mountains in the middle ground, and the other mountains in the distance. The problem is the lake. Where does the foreground stop and the middle ground start? And what happens when the edge of the lake in the foreground moves over the edge of the lake in the background? If you don't understand what that means, we discuss the concept of layers overlapping each other in extensive detail later on in this tutorial. You might think that you could make the cut along this portion of the water that has a sort of line on it, but I tried this, and when the foreground moved over the background, this line was really obvious and drew your attention to it. So instead, I cut in the middle of the rippled water. The water in this area all looks the same, so when the foreground moves over the middle ground, you don't see any difference. That's why this animation works so well. So back to our image, which in some respects is trickier than any of those images because those images had obvious separate layers. The challenge with this image is that there aren't any obvious separate layers. In this image, everything touches everything else. You see the ocean without any real breaks in it other than the waves. You might think you could cut at the edge of the waves, but it creates the same problem as the previous image that had the line in the water. Your attention is drawn right to it when the image is animated. So instead, we want to cut in the middle of the water between the waves because it's all indistinct. If we cut here and feather the edges, then each layer will blend in with the one behind, so you can't tell where one layer ends and the next starts. So that's what we'll do. You could make a fourth layer if you really wanted, but you'd never notice it since your attention is drawn to the horse. Here's the layers after they've been cut out. The foreground, the middle ground. I should point out that before we're done, we'll be feathering the edges, so right now the edges are cut higher up than necessary. We'll remove the extra portions when we feather them. And the cleaned up background. I didn't really need to clean up the bottom of the middle ground and background because they'll never be exposed. I think I just got carried away. We'll leave the edges just like they are and see how this looks when animated. We're back in motion now with our 3 layers. I've positioned each layer at different distances from the camera like they would be in real life. Let me orbit the camera around and you can see how they're positioned. Here's the side view. This is the foreground, this is the middle ground, and this is the background. This is how the camera's view of the layers change as the camera moves. Let's see how the animation looks now that we have the layers. Remember that we haven't feathered the edges yet. Compare that to the single layer animation. Quite a bit different, wouldn't you say? So why does this work? What's the secret behind the magic?
Do you believe in magic?
I've taken our 3-layer image and drawn a grid on each layer. The foreground layer's grid is yellow, the middle ground is green, and the background is red. When we start out, everything lines up, but watch what happens. First secret, it's a moving experience. To simulate panning up, down, left, or right, objects in one layer move differently compared to objects in another layer. Take a look at this video. As I move the camera up and down, the object in the distance, in this case the tree in the middle of the yard, doesn't move up and down as much as the objects in the foreground, which are the roses. Now watch the yellow lines across the horse's head. Since the horse's head in the foreground is closer to the camera, it moves up faster than the background does, just like real life. Second secret, it's all relative. To simulate zooming in or out, objects in one layer change size at a different rate than objects in another layer, relatively speaking. Back to the real-life video. As I move the camera toward the roses and back, notice that the object in the distance, again, the tree in the yard, doesn't change size very much, but the objects in the front, the roses, change size quite a bit. Remember how the grids all started out the same size? Look at them now. The middle ground has zoomed in more than the background, and the foreground has zoomed in more than either of them. That's because the foreground is closest to the camera, so when the camera dollies in, the foreground will grow faster than the other layers, just like real life. Third secret, stay in touch. Connected objects should stay connected. Look again at the horse's head. It's not connected to the water in the background, so it's okay for them to move at different rates. In fact, it's a requirement if we want our animation to work. Remember secrets 1 and 2. The horse's head, however, is connected to its body, so the head and body must move pretty much the same, or we might end up with a scene from The Godfather. Fortunately, we do allow the horse to keep its head, so it looks like we've got the third secret down also, right? No. I've taken a real-world video and zoomed in on a section and slowed it down. Watch as the foreground moves up over the background. Now here's a 2.5D image of the same scene. The two layers are cut in the middle of the lawn. Notice how obvious the two layers are. I'll show them again. The lawn is all connected, so it should move smoothly like this. It should not, however, split in the middle like this. Consider these arrows. They point at the same basic spot in the water. Obviously, one part of the water is connected to another part of the water. It's all water after all. So watch what happens when we run our animation. The water that is supposed to remain connected doesn't. So secret number 3 is in conflict with secrets 1 and 2, right? Actually, it's not. Secret number 3 is actually, connected objects should appear to stay connected. The trick is to spread out the changes so you can't really tell where one layer stops and the next starts. Blend the edges of the layers. Here's the foreground layer with the top edge feathered. I hesitated using the term feathered. It's technically the correct term, but it implies something like using a feathering option of some tool, and that's not how these images were feathered. I used a gradient transparency to feather the edges. If you don't know how to create one, just Google it. I found hits for both Photoshop and GIMP. Since I wanted to feather the water but not the horse, I had to make a couple of selection masks to accomplish this, but it's not hard at all. Here's the middle ground layer. This was simple to feather. So let's see how this feathering helps the animation. Here we are back in motion. Let's run the animation one more time, this time with the foreground and middle ground layers having feathered edges. No annoying hard lines between layers. In fact, the more you watch this, the more you'll be hard-pressed to define the actual edges. Sort of like...
Abracadabra.
Magic! Sorry, I couldn't resist. We're near the end of this tutorial now. In a moment, I'll recap the 3 secrets along with a nice montage. I wanted to thank you for watching this tutorial. Please give it a thumbs up if you found it useful. And don't forget my other tutorial for Apple Motion that goes over how to do the actual camera animation we used in this tutorial.